the best way to engage and interact with these broadcasts, which you can do by following the link that's in the description of the broadcast. And if you're on HAPS, that will mean that the various comments and so on will be more easily seen and more easily able to interact with anything or ask any questions. This is another broadcast I'm doing as part of 30 Days Wild, and 30 Days Wild is a program of sort of events or activities organised by the wildlife trusts here in the United Kingdom, and it's about encouraging people to get out and engage with the natural world every day in June, hence the 30 days. So that's a series of broadcasts. I've been doing one on here for every day of that so far, apart from one day which I missed where I just put a photograph up. What I was doing today is, last night I was down at Horsenden Farm on Horsenden Hill. Horsenden Hill is a nature reserve area of wildlife in London Borough of Ealing, run by Ealing Council with a lot of help from a group called Friends of Horsenden Hill. And I was down there last night running a couple of moth surveys on the Horsenden Farm site. I was doing that in part just because it's interesting, and in part because I'm leading a walk later today around that site looking for some butterflies, looking for particularly white leather hair streak butterfly, which is a moderately unusual species and one that there is a good population of on this site. But as part of that event, I also ran these moth traps, so I've got some moths to show people. And that will be something I'll be doing later on. But what I thought we'd do is we'd have a quick look at least some of the moths from last night here on the broadcast. I'm going to do that using my other device, my mobile phone, which will act as another camera when I switch it on in just a moment. And I will just activate that and go onto HAPS on here, and we'll use this as a camera. We'll get some interesting feedback when I bring this on, but never mind. So just going to tweak various bits of the sound. And with any luck, this will shortly appear on the HAPS platform. And you can see here that currently I'm down at Perivale Wood, which is just next to Horsenden Hill, and I'm out in the site there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this into being the main picture, and we're going to have a look at some of the moths. Mainly going to look at them in pots today, unfortunately, because I don't want to I'm going to be showing other people these later on. So we'll have to be a bit creative and hopefully we'll be able to see them. So this is the first species, is poplar grey, Acronicta megacephala. Presumably somebody thinks it's got a big head, but a fairly common moth. Not one we see absolutely every time we trap here. It's rather nice. What else can you have a look at? In this pot we've got a buff tip. A buff tip is a moth that camouflages itself by looking very much like a bit of broken twig, and perhaps a birch tree. Phalaria bucephala is its scientific name. It's a very common moth, we get lots of them, but it's always one that sort of impresses people and they like to see it. So I was glad I got one of those for my event to show people a bit later on. What else have we got in here? We've got here a white ermine moth. White ermine. Again, a very common species. Spilosoma lubricipeda. Ermine, the name ermine perhaps, well, comes from this sort of white with black spots pattern, which is kind of what the pattern of ermine, the fur, looks like, and hence these moths got called ermine moths, as do several other moths in different families that have this black and white spotty pattern. What else have we got? Ah, yes. Rather metallic looking moth. This is burnished brass. Diacrisia chrysitis. And you can see it's got these metallic looking areas on the wing that seem to sort of shine and reflect the light. Presumably structural colours of some kind, where the structure of the scales is doing something to reflect and bounce the light back. There are two forms of this species. This is the one where the golden areas are separated by a solid dark bar, which is known as form aurea. There is another form where the gold is joined up and it forms a sort of H shape. And there is potentially another species which looks very similar to that form of it, but can't easily be identified. But we know that this is form aurea of burnished brass. And in here we have a willow beauty, Peribatodes rhomboidaria. Fairly common moth again, in fact very common moth. You see lots of these. These often do come to lights and kitchen windows. But one of the distinctive features is, maybe you can just see in the corner of the underside of the wing there, that pale corner to it, which suggests that. Hello, David. So I've probably got about 35 species. I haven't totted up the total number of moths yet, David. But it's, yeah, probably got about 35 species in total, which is not a vast number. Maybe a few more. I've hung on to a few micro moths that I can't identify. Let's have a look at a few more before I have to go. This, I think, is rather a funky one. So this is buff archers, which is Habrosine pyritioides. There we go. But it's got these really convoluted and wavy lines running all over it. It's a really complicated wing shape. Well, not wing shape, the wing shape is pretty simple. But they have all these crossing. I suspect like that this is in part pattern breaking camouflage. It makes it quite hard for something to actually work out what it's looking at, a bird or something. It'll be looking to eat this moth. The structure makes it quite hard to work out what that is and choose whether to eat it. So far, these have all been pretty common species. That's not much. Oh, that's not bad. Actually, it's the dark archers. Apamina monoglypha. I'm looking at my hand again. That's not very interesting, is it? Again, a pretty common species. Feeds on lots of. I think this is a broadleaf plant feeder. Fairly common stuff. Always rather nice. I'll pull out a couple of others of interest. I'm not going to have a long to broadcast because I need to get to the event I'm running later on. This is regarded as a pest species. It's called the box moth or the boxworm moth. It's a perfectly attractive species, and it feeds on box trees. It was accidentally introduced to the United Kingdom. With, I think its origins are somewhere in East Asia. Sidolema perspectalis is the scientific name. And it's causing a lot of trouble for people who have ornamental box trees in their garden. The caterpillars of this can do really large amounts of damage. That said, I think it's a very attractive looking moth. If it wasn't something that had been introduced artificially and causing problems, it's a really nice thing to see. But clearly a problem for the gardening world. What else is in here? Let me just find something else. This, which is staying very active, is a common swift moth. It hasn't got to Fiona yet. Slightly surprised. It's certainly made it as far as North Norfolk. So anyway, this is a common swift moth, which has recently changed its name. So I've got to have to look up my bit of paper to work out what species it is now called. Courcellus lupulina. And they're called the swift moths in part because they seem to arrive at the same time of the year as the bird called the swift. Possibly also because they tend to fly low over grassland, which again the swifts, the birds, sometimes do when they're collecting insects. And these are quite a primitive group of moths. These are quite early in the evolutionary cycle. Unlike most moths have sucking mouth parts. They have a proboscis that they use to suck up. Let me see if I can make this behave. That they use to suck up liquids and get nectar that way. These species, the swifts, as I understand it, have a much simpler mouth parts that to some extent are involved in crushing pollen. But they're fairly early species, and if you're familiar with insects, they look a bit caddisfly-like in structure. I mean, caddisflies are another order of insect, but are somewhat close in evolutionary terms to the moth. Now what we've got here, this is probably the species I was happiest to get last night. It's called dotted fanfoot. It's a relatively unusual moth, not super rare, but pretty unusual. And I've probably only seen it on this site once or twice before. It's Macrochila crimbumalis. Anyway, is its scientific name. And it's a noctuid moth associated with reed beds, and it does occur as a migrant. But I don't see that very often. So when that was sitting on my traps this morning, I was really rather happy. And I'm conscious I'm now starting to run out of time. So I think what I'm probably going to do is I'm probably going to end the broadcast with this moth, because it's a good one. And I will put its name up on the screen. But it is a reed bed species, and the reed bed species, we've been seeing a growth in the population of reed bed species here in the sites around me, probably over the past 10, 20 years or so. We've seen quite a few of the ones that we thought were rare or didn't see very often become more common. And this is perhaps an example of that. This is perhaps a species that is colonizing the area quite well. So I'll put that name up on the screen. And I'll do that, and then I think we'll end there, and then I'm going to have to pack these away and head off to the event I'm leading, and hopefully find white letter hair streak butterflies, which we're looking for, and show them to people who want to see them. The weather, I have to say, is not looking very butterflyish out there. It's cold and miserable and generally unpleasant. But we'll end there on this dotted fan foot because I rather like it. Now we'll be back on here tomorrow.